Thank you so much, Minister. It is time now for our first keynote speaker. Professor Alison Ritter is Director of the Drug Policy Modelling Program at the University of New South Wales National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre. She came to full-time research from a career as a clinical psychologist in the drug and alcohol treatment sector, and her goal is to advance drug policy through improving the evidence base, translating research and studying policy processes. So to set the global scene, please welcome Professor Alison Ritter.
I think you managed to see one of my slides during Peter Dunn's presentation. It means I can skip over that one. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Thank you for the very warm Maori welcome, and I'd like to acknowledge the people of the land. I'm here to set the scene in relation to drug policy. I wanted to start with talking about the diversity of drug policy globally. We have countries that are legalising recreational cannabis use, the US, Uruguay and Canada, and we'll hear from some experts on that later this morning. We also have countries that have enormously strict and prohibitionist regimes like China and Russia. And I want to remind you that we have countries where governments kill people who use drugs, the Philippines and Mexico. So there's not a simple answer to this, and there's great diversity. And it's a complex policy problem. It's complex because multiple levels of jurisdictions are involved. There's the international conventions to which New Zealand and most other countries are treaties. There are national strategies, and there are also subnational and local policies. It's multidimensional. There's not one area of government that can have responsibility for the entire drug policy portfolio. It involves health, it involves education, it involves obviously criminal justice and attorneys general. It also involves families and social welfare. There are strong and often opposing community views about what to do about the drugs issue, and I'll say more about that later. And it's a policy area that's characterised by goal conflicts. There's not broad agreement about what the goal of drug policy should be. To give you one example, is the difference between the goal of drug policy is to reduce the amount of drug use versus the goal of drug policy to reduce the harms from drug use, irrespective of the amount of drug use. And these are issues, I think, that vex us in designing best drug policy. In terms of the components of good drug policy, first up, you need an overarching drug strategy, and I'm pleased to say that New Zealand actually has an excellent national drug policy, the 2015 to 2020 document. This document needs to specify what the goals are and to generate a shared vision and an agreement about what it is that we're trying to achieve. In addition to an overarching strategy, we need good drug laws and regulation. We need comprehensive healthcare. We need comprehensive prevention programs, including drug education and building resilience in our young people. We need harm reduction services, and we need criminal justice programs. And it's not just drug policy that we need to be concerned with across these areas. Drug policy absolutely intersects with human rights, access to healthcare, and all people treated humanely. There are also strong intersections with the approach to social welfare, reducing inequality and access to social welfare support. And indeed, it intersects with trade and development, an issue that may come up, particularly in terms of obviously international trade agreements, but also in terms of supporting democratic security and reducing the drug trade. So you can't just focus on the direct drug policy areas, you also need policies across these other areas. I'm going to focus on laws and regulations rather than the harm reduction, health and so on, and you'll hear more about that over the course of today and tomorrow. So the question is, how do we design best practice drug laws? Well, we know the answer. The answer is a public health approach to drug laws. And this has been endorsed by numerous international bodies, the World Health Organization, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the UN Development Programme, the Global Commission on Drug Policy, the International Drug Policy Consortium, and Fordham's here and will be speaking with you later. Even smaller groups like the West African Commission on Drugs, and of course, the New Zealand Wellington Declaration endorsed a public health approach to drug laws. But what does a public health approach to drug laws actually mean? I think there are 4 features of a public health approach to drug laws. The first is that it focuses the laws and the enforcement of those laws on the drugs or criminal activities that cause the most harm. In a sense, this is a version of it being proportionate, which is the term I think that Peter used. Secondly, it de-emphasises the criminalisation of drug use. One option is decriminalisation. I'll say more about that in a minute. Thirdly, it ensures that laws are proportionate and just. And fourthly, it embraces laws and policies that ensure the rights of people who use drugs. Those would be the key characteristics of a public health approach to drug laws. The challenge, I think, though, is that within this, there's multiple options. They're a set of principles. They don't tell you exactly what kind of design. I'm just wondering whether I've got a pointer here. Oh, uh-oh. I'm sorry. Could I have some technical assistance, please? In designing a... I have no idea. Sorry. In designing a public... thank you. Perfect. Is there a pointer? There's no pointer. Okay, thank you. So in designing a public health approach to drug laws and consistent with those principles, there are multiple options. This slide comes from John Corkins and colleagues from RAND. It's in relation to the regulation of cannabis, but I think it provides an important overview of the options. So on the left-hand side, you can see that there are the prohibition options. There's prohibition and increasing sanctions and prohibition and decreasing sanctions, which is decriminalisation. And on the far right-hand side, you can see that there's full legalisation options. And one of the things that Corkins and colleagues argue is that we spend an inordinate amount of time on the far right and the far left, and what we don't do is engage with all of the options that are in the middle. And in terms of talking about the different options that may achieve a public health approach to drug laws, we also need to think about how to balance availability and harm. I've been using this curve for many, many years, and it's published in a book chapter, and I was delighted to see that this curve's also being used in the model drug law reform document that the New Zealand Drug Foundation is putting up. What you can see here is, so on the horizontal axis, you've got the level of harm. So you've got very high harm, that's health and social harm, versus very low harm at the bottom. And along the bottom, you've got the availability of drugs or the legal regime. So the left-hand graph is the availability of drugs, and the right-hand graph you'll see prohibition and full legalisation. What we currently have for legal drugs is the top of the curve where it's, I'm sorry I don't have a pointer, where it says currently legal drugs. That's where we are. We have high availability, alcohol and tobacco, and we have high levels of harm associated with full legalisation and high availability. On the other side, for currently illegal drugs, we have low availability and prohibition, but we also have high harms as a result of the consequences of the criminalisation. So our challenge in achieving a public health approach to drugs is to move down the curve for legal drugs and down the curve for illegal drugs and reach some kind of optimal point. For currently legal drugs, we want to increase regulation, we want to decrease availability. Yeah? Peter Dunn spoke about alcohol and important measures to reduce the harms associated with alcohol. At the same time as we're moving down the curve for the currently legal drugs, we need to move down the same curve for currently illegal drugs. One of the arguments is that decriminalisation of currently illegal drugs sits somewhere in the optimal point at the bottom of the curve. So decriminalisation is regarded as the most common public health approach to designing drug laws, and I did just want to clarify some terminology that might be used over the course of these 2 days. Full prohibition is where the use of drugs and the possession of drugs for personal use is a criminal offence, drug supply is a criminal offence, and penalties are enforced in practice. Depenalisation is where drug use and possession for personal use is a criminal offence, but it has lighter penalties, or where the penalties are not applied in practice, and drug supply is a criminal offence. Depenalisation is not decriminalisation. Depenalisation is reducing the extent of the penalties whilst retaining it as a criminal offence. Decriminalisation is where drug use or the personal possession of drugs for personal use is not a criminal offence. It may be a civil offence or an administrative offence. It may be like a parking fine or some such. Drug supply remains a criminal offence. So decriminalisation, drug supply is a criminal offence. Legalisation of use possess is where drug use and possession is legal. It's neither a criminal nor a civil offence, and drug supply beyond personal use continues to be a criminal offence. And full legalisation is where the use and sale of drugs is legal. And we're mainly talking about decriminalisation and legalisation of use possess in relation to cannabis potentially, and full legalisation in relation to cannabis, as some of our speakers later this morning will talk about. So what have we learnt about decriminalisation? More than 25 countries have decriminalised the use and possession of illicit drugs. This is possession for personal use, mostly for cannabis. We know that it saves criminal justice system resources, it does not increase drug use, and it ameliorates the adverse social impacts for people who use drugs. The Portuguese Reforms, one of my colleagues, Dr. Caitlin Hughes, has led the scientific evidence evaluating what happened in Portugal. Portugal decriminalised all illicit drugs on the 1st of July 2001. The key goal was to treat drug use as a health and social issue. Importantly, they substantially expanded treatment and harm reduction services at the same time. So any evaluation of Portugal can't necessarily isolate the substantial expansion in treatment and harm reduction from the changed legal status. Those two things go hand in hand. And the research has shown that it's increased treatment access, it's reduced problematic drug use, it's reduced drug-related harms, and it's been a substantial reduction in the social costs of responding to drugs. I want to talk about 6 key considerations in designing a public health approach to drug laws and decriminalisation. The first issue is whether you do this formally through law or whether you do it informally through practice or the use of discretion. And again, these terms might be used. There is de jure, which is formal legal change, removing the criminal penalties, or de facto law reform, which means the laws remain, but practice changes, the way in which police work with someone who's in possession of a personal quantity of drugs. The problem with de facto law reform is that that gives opportunities for discrimination and for biased implementation, and it's absolutely not the preferred approach. So if you're going to make public health reforms for your drug laws, you want to do that formally in a de jure fashion. Second issue, and this is complicated, is the difference between possession and use versus supply. I think it's really important to keep these distinctions clear when these debates are occurring. But actually this can be quite hard because there are blurred boundaries. I think everyone would agree that someone who's using ecstasy at a particular event is clearly someone who's not supplying drugs. They may have one or two tablets, capsules, pills on them. At the other end of the spectrum, someone who's importing kilograms of crystal methamphetamine into New Zealand is clearly someone who is supplying drugs, and under decriminalisation that remains a criminal offence. But there's a blurry boundary in between, and particularly people who are heavily dependent on drugs and are injecting drugs, they are often selling drugs in order to maintain their own habit. Where do they sit in this, and how do we deal with this blurry boundary in the middle? It's all well and good to say let's legalise or decriminalise, personal use of drugs, but how many drugs does one have to have on one's person to make that personal use? And what about social supply, which is supply in the absence of the exchange of money? Do we regard social supply as personal use or not? So these are the things that need to be talked through. The third issue, of course, is which drugs. Obviously, the extent of harm differs between different drug classes. And you could progressively go through and just deal with Class A drugs, then Class B, then Class C. However, there is a sort of a cautionary tale. I mean, I think with decriminalisation, and this is certainly what's shown in Portugal, the principles of a public health approach to drug laws would be to decriminalise all drugs, because this is about drug use, not drug supply. And so I think distinguishing between different drugs in the decriminalisation of personal use has particular risks associated with it that could be quite problematic. The fourth consideration is what's the type of response. So, okay, if it's a criminal offence, you've got fines, you've got community orders, you've got compulsory treatment, which I forgot to put up there, and you've got prison terms. If personal use is decriminalised, you've got a caution, you've got a fine option, you've got assessment, brief intervention, referral into treatment. How many times can someone go through the system? Can they keep going through the caution or the fine or the brief intervention many times, or is there a limit? What happens if they're not compliant? Under full decriminalisation, nothing happens because it's not a criminal offence. But some versions of decriminalisation mean that if you don't go for your assessment and brief intervention, you can then be charged with the original offence. And there's a whole bunch of issues that we will get to at some point during today about a legalised regulated market. Which drugs does this apply to? What types of growing, selling and consuming restrictions? I think even in this very brief summary of some of the key considerations in designing good drug laws, there's a complex maze of options and considerations. And this is Australia for you, so don't follow us, for goodness sakes. We have 3 states that have de jure reform, only for cannabis. There's a fine, there's no limits, and the response to non-compliance varies. We have de facto reform in every state and territory in Australia, some for cannabis, some for all drugs. Some of them are just a caution, some of them are just an assessment, some of them have no limits, some of them have 2 or 3 or 1. Many of them still retain criminal penalties. So this mess is not to be replicated. So how do you choose the best design system? Well, to be really honest, I've given you the evidence about Portugal, but I can't give you any evidence about those design features. I can't tell you whether having no limits or 3 limits works better. I can't tell you what the different evidence base is for the consequences of non-response to an intervention. We would agree, of course, that good design needs to be built on the principles of equity, human rights, proportionality, but that doesn't tell you how to actually design your system. And as I hope I've shown, the devil is in the detail. Given that we don't have an evidence base, my argument is that we need a collaborative and deliberative design process which is consistent with democracy. And I wanted to end with some comments about democracy. Governments need to act in ways which accord with what the people want. That's actually the definition of democracy. Democracy is the government expressing the collective will of the people. And indeed, policy only works when people trust the government and their policy actions. So there's an important relationship between the two. And as Sheila Jasanoff has said, the public is the theatre for establishing the credibility of state actions. So what do people want in relation to drug policy? Here's some Australian data to kick this off. This is raw public opinion, 24,898 Australians asked about their support. I've just chosen 3 items: needle syringe programs, injecting rooms, and legalisation of personal use of heroin. First thing you'll notice is the high don't know responses. When I arrived in Wellington yesterday, I asked the taxi driver what should be done about the drug problem. And he said, "I don't know." And I thought that was a particularly honest response. He did also tell me that in the rugby match on the weekend, 2 pubs were drunk dry, which seemed to be pretty extraordinary. I don't know whether that's true or not, it's taxi drivers. So a lot of people don't have a view and don't know it, but do appreciate that it's complicated. The second thing is the problem with these kind of public opinion surveys is that they're called raw public opinion because the way you ask the question matters enormously. So if you give people more information at the beginning, they will give a different response, and there's a lot of research evidence around this. And so it's not necessarily thoughtful or considered. And the third problem is, which public are we talking about? Are we talking about the people who are most directly affected by the drug laws, or are we talking about the general population? And if we're talking about the people who are most directly affected, here are the opinions of people who inject drugs. 97% support NSP, 80% support injecting rooms, and 56% support the legalisation of the personal use of heroin. Is that the public that we should be most concerned with, or is it the general public? I did manage to look at the New Zealand opinions in relation to cannabis, some work commissioned by the New Zealand Drug Foundation. This poll you'll be very familiar with, conducted in August 2016. On the one hand, there's a strong argument to say that 64% of New Zealanders agree with either the legalisation or decriminalisation of the personal use of cannabis, the first line, and I think 64%'s been the highlight figure. I would like to point out that 34%, not a substantial, not an insubstantial minority, believe that personal possession of cannabis should remain illegal. And you can see across here that there is a diversity of views, and we shouldn't try to pretend that there's not a diversity of views. In a democracy, we want to hear this diversity of views, and I'd be very interested to see the breakdown between different groups within New Zealand, including people who use cannabis, people who don't, etc. So I'm arguing that we need to engage the public. We need to move beyond raw public opinion. We need to garner considered views about what to do about drugs. And we absolutely need to engage the affected community. These are the people who are most impacted by the decisions that are made around drug laws. In line with democracy and the notion of collective will, we want to do what the people want. We also want to not just listen to the experts. And a quote here from Mansbridge: "The exclusion of non-experts from policy deliberation threatens the foundation of democracy itself." So experts need to step to one side, certainly provide the evidence base, but then we need an engaged, democratic, inclusive conversation. I couldn't resist. So this is not the model of designing a public health approach to drug laws in New Zealand that is democratic and inclusive. People will recognise this as a piss take on Trump. Luckily, this is not necessarily a new area. The work in practice and in theory around deliberative democracy is exactly what we need. The features of democracy, political equality, participation and deliberation, can be achieved through what are called representative mini-publics, groups of people that represent the diversity of views. In a sense, today and tomorrow we're a version of a mini-public, but we haven't deliberately made sure that all of the views are going to be expressed in this process. Deliberative democracy ensures a strong, diverse set of views and involves a rational, impartial, inclusive and egalitarian deliberation, where issues can be carefully weighed and listened to with an open mind, and where, to quote Habermas, the force of the better argument, not the person making the argument, wins the day. High quality deliberation involves these 5 key features. This is from James Fishkin's book called When the People Speak. Firstly, it needs information that is accurate and relevant. Secondly, there must be substantive balance. All the arguments need to be given. Thirdly, there needs to be diversity, and one way of thinking about that is the extent to which the major positions in the public are represented by the participants in the process. Fourthly, it needs to be done conscientiously, sincerely weighing the merits of the argument. And lastly, all arguments are given equal consideration. Arguments are considered on equal merit regardless of which participant offers them. There's lots of different approaches to deliberative democracy: citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies, deliberative polling, and a variety of mini-publics processes. I would strongly encourage New Zealand and perhaps the Drug Foundation to lead a series of these mini-publics in a way I think that we have begun today. Any of these kinds of strategies could be employed in New Zealand. The devil is in the detail in designing a public health approach to drug laws in New Zealand, and experts aren't going to get you there. You need to engage with all of the views, and I'm sure you'll be successful in designing the best drug policy. Thank you very much.